Welcome back to another Explainer. Today we're taking a really fascinating biomechanical deep dive into how our bodies actually adapt to different exercise movements. We're going to look past the mirror, past the tape measure, and zoom all the way down into the microscopic architecture of your muscle fibers to see what is literally happening when you lift.
Right off the bat, I want to challenge a piece of classic gym lore that you've probably heard a million times. We're always told that the eccentric phase of a lift, the negative or the lowering of the weight, is vastly superior for building massive muscle. People absolutely obsess over slow negatives. But does the science actually support this? Which phase of the movement truly forces your body to build more tissue?
Okay, let's get into it. You probably already know the basics, but let's quickly re-rack the mechanical differences just as a refresher. Every single time you move a weight, your muscle goes through two distinct phases. A concentric contraction happens when your muscle shortens to overcome a load, like curling a dumbbell up towards your shoulder. An eccentric contraction occurs when the muscle lengthens to control deceleration. A highly relatable example of this is just walking downstairs and, trying not to completely collapse the day after a brutal leg workout. Your quads are actively generating force while simultaneously lengthening to act as a brake against gravity.
What's just wild about these two phases is how fundamentally different they are, both mechanically and metabolically. The concentric phase has a significantly higher metabolic cost. It burns a ton of energy, but it actually has a lower overall force capacity. On the flip side, the eccentric phase has a way lower metabolic cost, yet it's capable of generating far greater force. In fact, research shows the energy cost of positive concentric work is about 6 times greater than negative eccentric work. Eccentric movements are surprisingly hyper-efficient, even though they feel intensely heavy.
To put a number on that sheer physics discrepancy, eccentric contractions can generate up to 1.8 times more maximum force than concentric ones in a lab setting, all while utilizing less energy. It's a massive biomechanical advantage. But how exactly does the muscle fiber actually pull this off at a microscopic level?
Now, inside your muscle, you have these contractile filaments called actin and myosin that grab onto each other to generate force. During a fast concentric shortening, the flexible tail portion of the myosin molecule, the S2 complex, gets compressed, which results in a lower pulling force. But during an eccentric lengthening phase, that S2 complex acts exactly like a coiled spring. It stretches out fully before it's forced to detach, producing massive force. Plus, there's a giant protein in your muscle called titin that winds around these filaments, storing and releasing elastic energy, basically like an internal bungee cord.
So the eccentric phase generates nearly double the force and utilizes elastic internal springs. The obvious assumption is that eccentric training has to be the holy grail of muscle growth, right? Does that massive eccentric force actually translate to more overall muscle volume?
Let's walk through the aggregate data from dozens of clinical studies to debunk this myth once and for all. When researchers strictly match the two training modes for maximum load and work volume, the results are kind of shocking. Look at the metrics for muscle girth, muscle volume, and anatomical cross-sectional area. The outcome? Similar growth across the board. There's no clear superiority. When matched for the actual work you do, overall muscle growth, in terms of sheer size, is virtually identical whether you only lift the weight up or only lower it down.
So here's the million-dollar question. If the total volume of muscle gained is exactly the same, what exactly is the difference? The answer lies in how the muscle tissue physically reassembles itself. The total mass is the same, but the microscopic blueprint, the architectural remodeling, is completely different.
To really wrap our heads around this, we need a visual anchor. Think of two main features of muscle architecture that we can actually see on an ultrasound of a thigh muscle. First, you have fascicle length, which is literally just how long the bundles of muscle fibers are. Second, you have the pennation angle, which is the angle at which those fibers attach to the connective tissue at the bottom. Keep these two specific geometries in your head, the length of the fiber and the angle it sits at.
Now, here is the mind-blowing difference in how your body adapts. Concentric training triggers the body to add new muscle units, called sarcomeres, in parallel. Think of this literally like adding more lanes to a highway to handle more side-by-side traffic. It increases the angle and the thickness. Eccentric training, on the other hand, triggers the body to add sarcomeres in series. This is like making the highway miles longer by stringing sections end to end.
And this structural shift is incredibly vivid when you look at it through ultrasound. You can clearly see the original state compared to the post-training growth. With in-parallel growth from concentric lifting, the fibers get stacked so much denser, increasing that pennation angle. But with the in-series growth from eccentric lifting, the muscle physically stretches out, increasing the longitudinal fascicle length. It's amazing.
We can actually quantify this structural shift, too. In isolated studies comparing the two, concentric training caused a massive 30% spike in the pennation angle while barely moving the needle on length. Conversely, eccentric training caused a 12% spike in fascicle length with almost zero change in the angle. Guys, your muscle is literally choosing a completely different 3D shape based entirely on the direction of the resistance.
And get this microscopic architecture results in very visible regional growth on your body. Because concentric training adds lanes to the highway, it tends to thicken the mid-belly of the muscle, giving you that classic pumped look right in the center. Eccentric training, because it adds length in series, actually drives hypertrophy at the distal ends of the muscle, way down near the tendons. So one builds the middle and the other builds the ends.
The molecular construction crew. Now that we've seen the visible architecture, let's pivot for a second into the cellular signaling. How does your body's cellular construction crew actually know which of these two blueprints to use?
Well, it all comes down to mechanical tension in chemical signaling. High tension triggers specific pathways in the muscle, like the MAPK networks that signal protein creation. But eccentric loads do something highly unique. That intense stretching heavily activates your satellite cells. Those are basically the stem cells of your muscles. These satellite cells orchestrate a really profound and prolonged remodeling of the extracellular matrix, which is the connective scaffolding around your muscle fibers. In fact, collagen genes associated with building this matrix can remain highly active up to 27 days after just a single heavy eccentric session. No wonder you're so sore.
All right, let's pull all this together and synthesize the core takeaways for your own practical application. First, we've got to drop the myth that one phase builds way more mass than the other. When matched for work, both phases build identical overall muscle volume. Second, concentric lifting thickens your muscle by packing fibers side by side in parallel. Third, eccentric lifting physically lengthens your muscle by stringing fibers end to end in series. So the reality is, to build a truly optimized, functional, and injury-resilient muscle, you absolutely cannot ignore either phase. You need both of these architectural adaptations.
Which leaves us with this final thought. Now that you understand your body isn't just mindlessly getting bigger, but is dynamically reshaping its internal geometry based on exactly how you move a weight, knowing how your muscle tissue structurally reassembles itself, how are you going to redesign your training based on this microscopic reality? Keep learning, keep lifting, and we'll see you in the next explainer.